Okay, so we are back to Reagan, culture wars, and recent American history. And so now we're going to get into a little bit more of the details, in particular, a focus on Reagan today. So Reagan, his background was that he was a governor from California, and he was pretty strongly anti-communist, and had a pretty black and white moral outlook. So he didn't really have a very moderate position on a lot of issues. He had some pretty strong things to say one way or the other, and he really began to propose that there was a new day in America, right? Kind of a renaissance or a reemergence of American power and influence and affluence. And he was really charismatic, that he was an actor earlier in his life. So there's a picture of him as a Western star. And so he had a lot of pull and a lot of connection with people, and really began to channel the anger that mainstream white Americans might have at minorities or immigrants or feminists or taxes or affirmative action or anything having to do with big government. So he was really able to focus that in to a message that appealed, and so a lot of people were for Reagan. And so his conservative vision was a recast of some issues in America. So one, he said that Vietnam was a noble cause, that maybe we weren't successful, but certainly we were there for the right reasons, kind of rebranding that event in some Americans' minds, giving it a little bit more credibility and honor than maybe once was there, fresh from our withdrawal in '75. The renewal of the Cold War, he didn't want a détente like Nixon did. He wanted a head-on confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the American power was a huge part of his political push, that America should be the top dog. We should let people know what we want them to do and influence them to do that. A strong emphasis on patriotism and loving one's country. That is his roots, and he tries to express that politically. And traditionalism, that he doesn't stand for change that has been taking part in our country, but really embraces some older ways of viewing oneself and one's country. He also advocated a big part for states' rights, that states should be choosing a lot of these decisions and not being mandated by the federal government. An emphasis on individualism, that people should be responsible for their actions, and really that is the essence, right? Trying to make your way in America, every man for himself, the land of opportunity, and really a feel-good mood. He was really successful in accomplishing and putting out these kind of messages. And so he gets elected. And one of his big economic pushes was what was called or termed Reaganomics. He didn't come up with that himself, or the trickle-down theory or supply-side theory. And really, his idea was that if you gave money to certain parts of the economy or certain parts of the government, they were much better at spending that and having economic outcomes. So one, he was a huge supporter of the Department of Defense and increases its funding by 45%, and creates, in part because of that, a debt of $3 trillion during his presidency. And he is part of seeing a rising number of Fortune 500 companies. So America's success does begin to rebound in the 80s. And but he is president during a time in which the expansion of the working poor, so people who have full-time jobs, but the income of those jobs is not really sufficient to put them into a middle-class working position. We'll show a couple pictures that you're probably familiar with here in just a second. And a decline in real wages, so that people's money doesn't go as further as it used to, and people have just less value in the money that they make. And household debt does increase. Americans start spending more and more, and so Americans owe a lot, in particular in credit cards. And he's a president during the devaluation, the saving loans crisis, which is a little bit of a detailed situation that we may or may not have a chance to talk about in class. He's also famous for being the president who said ketchup is a vegetable and gets that passed in school lunches, but also cuts taxes to boost income for wealthy Americans. And really, this is part of the Reaganomics, that his philosophy, as well as some economists of the time, really that if you cut taxes on the wealthy, they're going to spend and invest that money, and that would have a trickle-down effect on the middle class and lower class Americans. And he was a big proponent of privatization, that as much as you can get private companies involved and not government, that was a good thing. So privatizing things like roads or bridges, and deregulation. He wanted to cut out some of the regulation that government had put in place for things like industries, so that they had less rules they had to follow. His theory is that makes companies more competitive. And so, like I said, there's a new working class or class warfare. So this deindustrialization hits America pretty hard in the 80s as companies shut down and move jobs overseas. Like we see, 1 million manufacturing jobs are lost alone in 1982. And there's a huge growth of non-union service sector jobs. So good old Mickey D's in the 80s. You can flip some burgers, right? And unions really take a dive in the 80s. That millions of members are lost because their jobs are lost, so that they no longer really are part of a union. So unions really begin to see a huge decline in the 80s, and federal subsidies are given out to corporations. So the government begins to give tax breaks or tax incentives, or in some cases cash payouts to certain companies and industries. So they're really picking favorites to some degree here in the 80s. And another issue that arrives in Reagan's presidency is what's called the Iran-Contra affair. And so there was an election held in Nicaragua in '79, and there was this group called the Sandinistas, and the U.S. did not like them. Basically, we sold military land and weapons to Iran, and in return, we'd get their hostages out from the Iranian hostage crisis. So that's kind of the wrap-up of that. And we used weapons, and they used those weapons against Iraq when they had a war, but we gave this money to the Contras, who would fight the Sandinistas, and Colonel Oliver North is pretty famous for his involvement in the political proceedings and the investigation that happens because of this. And basically it was an illegal sale of U.S. property without congressional approval, which is a no-no because they're in charge of the purse strings. And this aid to the Contras to overthrow this government in Nicaragua really violated a Boland Amendment. So there were some big issues, and it really makes sense a little bit more when we look at this diagram. So the U.S. opposed the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, so we gave secret weapons to Iran, right? And the money from those weapon sales were sent to the Contras, and the Contras fight the Sandinistas, and this destabilizes actually both reasons, because now there are more guns and weapons in Nicaragua and in Iran, and so there's further conflict, and this cycle kind of continued. And then a whole other topic is culture wars. I've used this word a couple times, but really what this boils down to is some pretty significant issues that still exist today. So a disagreement about abortion, right, and immigration, who and how much of people to let in, affirmative action, what's the role between trying to create equality between people and education in the workforce, bilingual education, should Spanish be an official language, or should English be the only one? The arrival of multiculturalism, so this idea that America has more than one culture, more than just the dominant or majority culture of whites in America. Communism, right? That our great enemy as Americans. Homosexuality, seen as a social taboo here, at least in the 80s. And taxation, how much should the government be taking from you? And issues of church and state. Where is this separation between church and state? Where does that lie? So we can see here legalized and unauthorized immigration. So some pretty significant issues that still exist even today. And the culture war continues. How does the government and people respond to HIV/AIDS? Desegregation, so states' rights, so a state's ability to choose how they desegregate. So we have kind of a mixed desegregation across the country, even into the 80s. Things like school prayers yanked out of schools during this time, and some people want to see it back. Issues like abortion and affirmative action are seen as handouts to minorities that they didn't get it because they're the best candidate, but only because of their race. So I'm not advocating these. I'm just trying to explain some of the situations surrounding these controversial issues. Immigration was a pretty big one. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about. So background 64, we create a law that allows 8 million people legally into our country every year. And the Reagan administration sets up some new rules, and they're going to create a process for legalization and nominal fines. And really they focus on immigration from Southeast Asia and Latin America. So we give a lot of preference to these regions of the world, and the big reasons are economics, right? We want these people to come in as workers, and the obstacles, though, to immigration are the culture wars and racism that is a part of this. The Border Patrol has a difficult time keeping the border clear, as well as they're seen as kind of gatekeepers, keeping certain people in and out, and there's propositions against bilingual education, so Spanish primarily and English, but other languages as well in different regions of the country. And really, should we give public schooling to immigrants, in particular illegal immigrants, or health care for undocumented workers? These are big question marks. How do we treat others who aren't here legally or here by going through the process? And so some similar things we see, you know, in 1910, very different way, right? We're trying to keep people from getting into our nation, the deporting of the Reds. So we send out people who we think are not really good for us. And here in the 90s, another political cartoon, Uncle Sam asleep as people try to scramble in. Last things that really define Reagan's presidency are international events. He is president and takes credit, for the most part, for ending the Cold War. He takes a pretty strong stance, even calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. And but because of this harsh talk and a different leader emerges, Mikhail Gorbachev, pictured here, there begins to be some conversation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And really the fall of the Berlin Wall was a huge part of this. Prior to this, Reagan gives a speech, you know, telling the Soviets to tear down that wall. And really, we can see Reagan in the office as the Soviet Union, or at least its satellites, begin to collapse. And Reagan, like I said, took credit for this. It only makes sense, I guess, if you're the president. And so some quick ideas. One, the election of Reagan, kind of his background and beliefs. Reaganomics, his economic policies, trickle-down theory, class warfare, that the rich and the poor, the working poor, the Iran-Contra controversy, so we're selling weapons to one country to get money to fund another's, some issues there. Culture wars, all kinds of controversial issues, and that's what we'll get into a little bit in class. The immigration issue, how do we treat and who do we allow to come into our country? And international events like the fall of the Soviet Union is earth-shattering. So these are some big ideas. If you think you can't really describe these in detail, I'd really encourage you to go back and check out certain sections where you think you might have missed. More to come. I'll see you guys in class. If you have questions, remember to ask. All right, have a good day, guys.